This week in Alaska history, an aviation pioneer is honored with his own memorial at the airfield that now bears his name.
The year 1932, 3 years after Russell Hyde Merrill disappeared. During this week's Storytime with Aunt Phil, author Laurel Downing Bill gives us a history lesson on this legend of the last frontier.
Merrill Field, one of the busiest airports in the entire country, right here in Anchorage. But this story begins in Southeast. Laurel, the year 1925, Russell Merrill arrives in Juneau.
July 1925, yes, he landed, and then the very next month he had one of many firsts. He and Roy Davis took off and headed for Seward to complete the first ever single airplane voyage across the Gulf of Alaska to land in Seward. And it was also the first commercial flight westward from Juneau. And then the same year, he and Ed Young took off from Nenana and carried mail to Nome for the first time. And then a couple years later, 1927, he discovered a pass that was named for him later, that actually it created a new route that was shorter to get to the Kuskokwim.
So a few weeks later, he would make history here in Anchorage, doing something that now we probably all take for granted.
The first night flight that landed in Anchorage, yeah. He had taken off on an emergency rescue mission to help out a school teacher in Ninilchik who had been wounded by a revolver. And by the time he got back to Anchorage, it was black. And so he flew around, and people from Anchorage came out where they could, and they built bonfires, and then those that had vehicles drove up and lighted with their headlights the landing strip so he could have a safe landing.
So back in the day, I mean, even today, flying in Alaska can be dangerous, and he ended up having a brush with death in 1928 on, again, another historic voyage of his.
One of the first commercial flight to Barrow. He and Noel Ween had taken off, and they got caught in a dense fog and had to make an emergency landing on an ice-covered pond. Well, after the fog cleared, Ween could get off because he had pontoons. Merrill could not, and so several days later, a musher and his dog team came upon Merrill, who by that time was snowblind, he was exhausted, and he couldn't go any further. But he had said he survived on eating everything that he could from the airplane, and then he started trapping lemmings and eating them raw. He did survive, of course. He ended up in a hospital in Barrow, but he almost died of Rocky Mountain fever from his diet of lemmings.
Lemmings, a diet of lemmings. So jump ahead 7 years, Merrill's unfortunate final flight. What happened, or how much of the story do we know?
Well, we know he took off from mid-September heading for Sleepmute, but that was the last time anybody ever saw him. And pilots like Carl Ben Eielson and Joe Crossan and others flew, gosh, 10,000 miles over 2 weeks looking for him, but they never found a trace. And then on October 3rd of that year, a piece of fabric did wash up onto one of the beaches in Cook Inlet, and it was identified as coming from the tail section of Merrill's plane. So that's what they know about that.
So even in death, though, his impact on the aviation industry would live on, specifically right here in Anchorage.
In May of 1930, the Anchorage City Council appropriated $500 in matching funds to help level and seed Aviation Field. And then that June, they renamed it Merrill Field. So that's what we have today.
And again, one of the busiest airports in the country, planes taking off and landing seemingly every few minutes.
We're right next to Merrill Field, and it's true. There are a lot of planes taking off and landing.
It is. I think some of the routes go right over our house as well. So it seems like a daily occurrence. The kids love it, and it's great. Another story, another history lesson for you this morning. We're learning things on Daybreak.
We are.